I arrived in El Salvador at night on January 4th, 1978. And when I got to the airport in San Salvador, which was then Ilopango Airport, which was a shell of a building, and it was dark, the luggage conveyor was broken, there were soldiers everywhere. Leonel Gomez Vives was nowhere to be found. I thought, what have I done? My suitcase is me, no Leonel Gomez Vives. He had sent a Peace Corps volunteer to pick me up and bring me to a dinner that he had arranged. But at that time, Congressman Drinan, a Democrat of Massachusetts, who happened to be a Jesuit priest, was conducting the first ever human rights investigation in El Salvador. And that coincided with my arrival. Leonel professed to the day of his death that that was a coincidence, that he had no idea that that human rights investigation was going to take place. But he said, you should follow them, you should watch them, you will learn a great deal, and not about human rights. He wanted me to learn about my own country and how we approached these situations and what we were or were not willing to do about them. He admired Congressman Drinan, but he also understood that human rights organizations and human rights advocates were not going to have much to say about American foreign policy decision-making at that time. And so he took me around the country. It was sort of, he was Beatrice. He was showing me hell. He showed me hell.
Company!
And I moved into the circles of this hell.
Ready!
And it was the beginning of my education.
Load!
It was like being present at a fire, and you see the firemen arrive,
Aim!
and the people are coming from the burning building, and you can't walk away.
Fire!
You have to stay. You're deeply and irrevocably implicated in something.
I came upon a man in black who sat on a tank tending his sheep that grazed impassively around the craters and among dead bodies. I'm looking for my son, I said, squinting. The bullets in his cartridge belt slung over his shoulder shone in the sun like teeth. He smiled, chewing a cigarette to the other corner of his mouth, and motioned with his hand to the field. Plenty to choose from, he said. The sheep were moving away toward the shade of a big oak tree, the bodies following on all fours. I strained my ears to hear the bell I knew. He slid down and stared at me. Is that your stomach growling? He asked. I'm just trying to find my son, I whispered. You want me to shoot one? He spat out the butt and stomped it with his boot. That was like my son's. You're talking about some good meat, he grinned. The shirt looked familiar, but I couldn't tell. My sheep started to fan out, and I suddenly heard a dog yelp behind him. He whistled, the sound, thin and piercing, making the bodies stop. I felt the sweat run down my buttocks and legs as if someone was punching holes in my ribs. Have you seen my son? I uttered, not knowing whether any sound left my mouth. You never had a son! He yelled and cocked his submachine gun. The boots were the same. and so was the shirt. And the Mickey Mouse watch on his wrist was the same. "Tell you what," he said and laughed. "I'll be your son."
Whenever you enter a new world, like a war is a new world, entirely different context in this world, then there's a diction that accompanies that.
How does a poet think, write, articulate their innermost feelings when they are confronted by torture, by imprisonment, by, in other words, having a gun put to their head and being forced to vow allegiance to some cause they don't believe in?
The sense of being confronted very directly and profoundly with your own mortality every single day.
If they feel disinclined to cooperate with the forces that are compelling them to behave in some particular way, what kind of punishment is it that's going to be meted out to them?
You can see that in the work. There's this prizing of life, this fierce prizing of life that I think only comes from people who have seen death so closely.
And what we find in our study is that those poets will try to enshrine their responses to that experience in their own individual way.
A lot of younger generations, my own daughter, and even in Romania, there are a lot of people who still don't know what happened.
I thought of literary art as entirely separate. Human rights activism was something I wanted to do, morally, ethically, spiritually. Poetry was an art that I'd been doing all my life. The two had nothing to do with each other, this is what I thought.
There is this tendency to forget, and we like to forget and move on very quickly.
I was capturing in my notebook, I think of it as a net catching butterflies, I was catching images.
But I think we have to pause and look at what happened and kind of realize that it's important to write about those things.
And I was making poetry, and it was almost like an escape, especially when I was terrified, which got to be often.
The person who suffers does not come back into a neutral world. They come back into a world which has certain reward structures in place. They have certain interpretive structures in place.
Salvadorans never question. They questioned, why didn't I write more? Why did I only write 7 poems? Why wasn't I writing another book about El Salvador?
The person who goes through this great suffering may find themselves at odds with the world that they've re-entered.
They wanted to be visible in the United States. They wanted these poems to flow out. I said, because I don't have more right now. I have to wait, you know. The North Americans, they wanted somehow to insist that this right to the experience was an important thing, and that one owned certain areas of experience or did not own them. And this is a question that's very difficult for me.
You know, when I first started writing these poems, I was getting advice from editors and from some teachers that I should stop in the early 70s, that no one was really interested in hearing about this anymore.
They may find themselves also pressured by that world and pressured to make whatever interpretations they have fit into the community that they re-enter.
I acknowledge, you know, the way that poets can give voice to their experience from particular, in ways that maybe aren't accessible by others, you know? But I don't think that one has to ignore one's own experience because one isn't of that environment.
Or else they would say, Robert Bly and Denise Levertov already did that. You know, they already wrote those poems. Go on to something else. You know, and I was thinking, wait a minute, we were the ones who were there. What about our version?
Poetry of witness is a kind of lens through which we can view poetry that is well known to us and see it afresh.
Culture is part of your environment. You live in it. Politics is part of your environment. You live, you know, the way that politics and culture allows you. So how can you leave them?
It enjoins us to bring to our reading of the poetry a knowledge of the life behind it, a knowledge of the experience that produced it, that made it what it was.
I am afraid if you classify me that way, you're going to end up saying, oh, this is just like confessional poetry, you know, which it is not.
Those things are all too apt to become lost, especially when academics start theorizing about it, start weaving all kinds of complicated intellectual ideas about it.
It's not that you go to your office from 9 to 5 and then go back and live, you know, somewhere else. You take out your suits, you know, throw away your shoes and start, you know, living around your house. You live with it 24 hours of your life, all the time. You cannot divide your life as a poet or as a person.
I have an additional problem. If I say it's, you know, not me necessarily, then the reaction may be, well, you know, if anybody can do that, you know, we don't have to listen or read you.
To me, a witness is someone who testifies. And sometimes they testify about things that may endanger them or may not be good for them. But there's a certain kind of bravery that's involved there.
In a way, poetry of witness gives us a rationale for turning again to it and reassessing it and recognizing its quality.
Because witnessing isn't just looking at something. Witnessing is seeing something and bringing it into your body and your mind and your heart and your soul. That's what witnessing is. So you feel the thing. Only then can you say, okay, I'm going to try to write about their suffering or my suffering. Only then.
When Viera was buried, we knew it had come to an end. His coffin rocking into the ground like a boat or a cradle. I could take my heart, he said, and give it to a campesino, and he would cut it up and give it back. You can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers where a man can be kept years. A boy soldier in the bone-hot sun works his knife to peel the face from a dead man and hang it from the branch of a tree, flowering with such faces. The heart is the toughest part of the body. Tenderness is in the hands.
Walter Benjamin spoke about you know, the vanquished don't get to write history.
The Anglo-Saxon period, as you probably know, characterized by a number of poems about battles. The problem is, in all cases, we simply don't know who wrote those poems.
Those of us who are among the victors, even if on the periphery of the victors, reach this moment of quote-unquote common decency and try to not forget about the others that the power system has completely vanquished, and bring them to the forefold through what is called, you know, a poetry of witness.
Poetry of witness is fundamentally a biographical study. It depends on our awareness of the poet's life, of the things they witnessed, the things they saw, most of all, the extremity through which they lived, or indeed died.
We want to hear stories of sadly abstracted others who are far away, who we bring service to, we provide voice for, and what have you. And it becomes, in my opinion, an act of holding power over those we supposedly serve in the presentation of their tragedy and of their narrative.
The description of what a person has produced as the product of pathology is a patronizing description.
I went with Doctors Without Borders. It was still good, better to go than not to go. But you know, I come back and I get interviewed and I publish books, and none of the people who I served and encountered are going to make it on camera.
Because one is always forgotten, I became a poem, an elegy for Viera, for Jose Rodolfo Viera. Viera was a friend of mine and a very close friend of Leonel Gomez Vidas. He was the head of ISTA, which was the organization that was responsible for the agrarian reform that was attempted in 1979 and 1980.
And I know nothing of their lives. I knew little of it when I encountered them, and I know nothing of their lives now. And nobody watching this will not even know what they look like, who their names are.
He was a campesino leader from very humble family, and he didn't want the job of being a leader. He was sometimes afraid. He understood my fear because he also had it. Both of us would shake a little bit. And he was killed with 2 American labor advisors who had asked to have a meal with him.
You remember, but do other people remember you? Do other things remember you? Things can remember you. I mean, this may sound crazy, but things do remember you.
When the story aired in American newspapers, only the names of the 2 Americans were given, not the name of the Salvadoran killed with them. I asked about that, and Leonel said, we never have names. So I decided, all right then, I'm going to put the name in a poetry book, and it will last longer than a newspaper article.
Stepped on by many feet, we were the specks of dirt on the floor. We were the crumbs waiting to be swept or pecked into oblivion by a chicken. We dreamed of escaping, of running away, or being carried by ants to their colony, but didn't own a passport. We were the small grapes in a basket under the table next to the door, waiting to be crushed by boots, left to ferment, strained, poured into a cup, and swallowed by a century already drunk.
Every culture that we look at has their own war, or many wars, every single one. And when they talk about those wars, they talk about them as if they were as if it was an anomaly, as if it was this strange series of events and confusion and complications and misunderstandings that led to this conflict. And how could this happen? We have to stop it.
It's getting to the point where younger generations are already kind of tired of hearing about this, but they still don't want to face what happened.
Memory is a dangerous thing, you know, for 2 reasons. You can warp it. That's dangerous. But in most cases, you do it intentionally. You know, you have an agenda. You know, so you know, for instance, what happened. You know how it happened. You know how you remembered it. But then you add, twist, change.
Nothing happened, and a lot of the people who perpetrated them are still free, and witnesses just died, and everything is vanishing.
But memory, when it comes to, you know, creative work, memory challenges you, and it can be dangerous because it forces you to not find an answer, but to deal with what you make of it.
You know, we started talking about PTSD in the mid-'80s. Not until then was it an illness. It's a way of remembering so that you don't remember, is what happens. So because I was a writer and I wrote about a lot of my experiences, I created some narratives that I could live with very easily.
It is possible that the experiences can create a totally new personality, a totally new writer, a totally new mentality.
Yet I was still bothered by memories of the war. And I'm 65 years old. I was in the war over 40 years ago.
The intellectual and creative structures that existed in your mind prior to the suffering are shaped and influenced by the suffering, but they're not fundamentally reshaped.
So to bring that to someone else and say, let this into your life, you know, is not an easy thing to do.
So many things that cannot be ultimately, you know, put on a piece of paper, because, you know, they escape reality, both the reality of memory or the reality as such.
Much of what went on in your early childhood, much of the socialization experiences that are pre-suffering, they may continue to influence you.
Things happen that you can only recreate later on. Not because you are recreating them in a literary piece, but you actually are recreating reality which you know cannot be justified.
The best creative work probably reflects some interaction between these prior formative experiences which existed when you had no idea you were going to suffer the way that you did, or to see the type of suffering that you saw, and then the experiences which emerge from that suffering.
I know someone who wouldn't believe me that my stories were true. And they were saying that because of my father, you know, because my father suffered, you know, that's nothing wrong with the system, it's just my father. So it's a particular case and a personal story. And I kept saying, it's not really a personal story. It's the story of a whole country. It's the story of a system.
Am I crazy? Crazy enough to know I am crazy? If what follows, what? They give me a pill to fall asleep, then another in the morning to remember who I am. Not to wander from myself. But do I know who I am? And when? Timing is everything, they say, and a record. I do not recall anymore when I went down. Time is not bound by gravity. Shall I go by the color of the pills? I keep my eyes open till the light makes the brain go blind, and I see again a girl who traded her body for 2 cans of meat slumped against the wall, my arm growing longer, trying to retrieve them. What is faster in this 3, 4, 5 seconds dream? My hand or the snipers chambering a bullet? Timing is everything, they say. The mattress is stained with other people's blood, sweat, urine. Mine? Faded and colorless? Is this how things end? Black and white rerun? Stop, go back now, stop, stop. What happened? What? Don't move. Is my hand still there, waiting for the right time? Is it losing its color? Does time have a color? Does memory? If to survive death is not to keep reliving it, someone must be there who knows, or here. If not, those who believe they saw everything know nothing. And by the same token, a witness to everything is a witness to nothing.
From the act of witness, from the standpoint of a powerful culture and being a member of a powerful culture, which I am as a Western-trained physician, as an American physician, it somehow becomes a problem that reflects, sort of shrinks back onto the performer, on the humanitarian, on the person who performs the act of witness, the poet of witness, the doctor of witness.
In an old-fashioned traditional sense, I think that no matter what kind of message you want to send through a story, a novel, a poem, you hope that it is going to cover more than just you, more than even just your country.
Writers want to be genuine. They want to tell the truth. Sometimes you might alter the superficial surface of things in telling that truth, but nevertheless, at the heart of it is a kind of truth. Whether it's the truth about suffering or dying or loneliness.
It's always within a scope, a frame, a Western frame, an American frame of gaze.
I think many writers who write about these kinds of things, like myself, also feel a responsibility to those who are dead on both sides.
And you can say whatever story, and I can tell you whatever story I want about some Angolan man or woman that I'd met. In the end, it would be about me, and it would be shrinking them and their narrative in my voice, in my words, and putting them on a ready plate.
We're telling their story too. And you know, you better get it fucking right.
The truth that I'm talking about is the loss of humanity, and where humanity is at a loss in these events.
But I do buy the idea that you can sort of perform, you know, a little bit of good against evil because you want to keep evil at bay.
It doesn't have a political agenda. It has to do strictly with a system who is oppressing its own people. There's no way to go around that.
One is caught in this duality of good and evil, and it is that slave and master kind of dynamic. And I think one, after a while, gets so wrapped up in it.
The writer who survives the Holocaust and produces a document, a poem, let's say a poem, and that poem inscribes the experience of the camp in some way. That poem becomes itself evidence of the Holocaust. It can be read as evidentiary rather than representational.
It is really just about the slave and the master, not who the good and the evil, and not who the good is supposedly consumed with representing.
This literature is not representational. It doesn't represent events in the world. It is evidence of those events.
So it then seems very much to make sense for the poet, even more honest for the poet to incorporate into their vision the visions of many, many, many others. However, once you do that, you realize that you have entered into the realm of poetry.
In Adorno's sense of the documents of barbarism, every document produced by a poet who has endured extremity. Not only have they gone through the extremity, their language has passed through it as well.
So I'm very often thinking of how would I, react to this if I were not I, if it were someone else.
I'm trying to really lend my voice, and I'm trying to be there, and I'm trying to be personal and kind of imagine how my grandmother would speak.
My younger sister would make drawings of houses with trees and everything, but she'd always draw a little girl who looked like her down in the corner of the paper. And I always wondered about it. She was in every drawing as an external being standing next to the house.
No person is just like a camera recording what they see. The imagination works on what they have experienced to produce a work of art.
I knew I was writing. In these poems, I believe that when I entered onto the page and the poem began to come, the being that was writing the poem knew that she was not Salvadoran, knew that she had to identify herself in some way.
It's a way of expressing my own feelings, really, using the different voices as almost like an orchestra, like different instruments in an orchestra.
If I was writing about El Salvador, but within my being, my subjectivity as a North American woman, poet of the time, and didn't make artificial claims about who I was.
But in the end, everybody else is an other, and I'm talking about them out of common decency.
I think it was important to me in some ways to be myself with respect to this experience. And I didn't purport to speak on behalf of others or for others.
Humanitarianism in its new form doesn't care to save the world or prevent wars.
I didn't try to imagine that I was one of the people in El Salvador. I was there. I had certain advantages. I could leave. That was an economic advantage, and it was a political advantage.
You are a human being, but that human being thing is not known to people. Being a citizen is known to people.
When epidemics happen, or natural disasters or political disasters afflict millions or thousands and thousands of people, you're there to show solidarity, support, and provide some fleeting basic comfort to them.
You can define yourself with all the rules that being a citizen taught you. But if I ask you what does it mean that you are a human being, you don't know, because you never lived as a human being without the rules of being a citizen.
After studying our faces for months, my son knows to beam is the thing to do. He'll spend years deciphering love, the injustice or the illusion of it. Having been brought into this world, volition is an afterthought. What will I tell him about land and language and burial places my father doesn't speak of? Perhaps my mother knows. In the movie, the dispossessed cannot return even when they're dead. The journalist felt rebuke for not having thought it mattered, or for having thought it mattered too much. Will I tell my son all nations arise after mass murder, that I don't know any national anthem by heart, can't sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game? I should turn to flowers and clouds instead, though this has already been said well. It is night. When he gazes into his mother's eyes at bath time, Qais and Layla, she announces after a long day's work. He giggles with his shoulders, not knowing he's installing a web in his amygdala or whichever places science thinks love dwells. Even love is a place? Oh, son, love no country and hate none, and remember crimes sometimes immortalize their victims, other times the victimizer. Remember how you used to gaze at the trampoline leaves on their branches? Don't believe the sound of the sea in a seashell. Believe the sea, the endless trope, and don't say much about another's language. Learn to love it while observing silence for the dead and the living in it.
If there was a vacuum, if this culture, we have the international culture about all this ethics, and moralities, was not there, how would we react? How would we look at ourselves as a person with all these roles to act as a citizen?
I try to understand them, and so in the system I try to look in from the different sides, but always keeping in mind the humanity of the victim who didn't have a chance to speak.
And I had to get inside that person and ask myself, who is this? What does he really want to say? What does he really have to say?
It's good somehow and necessary to just keep circling back to the question of self and other.
I don't want it to be a victim, this person telling about war. or about other experiences. I don't want, victimology is not interesting to me.
I think that in the whirling, if you will, between the self and other and the mirroring of it, then one may approach a performance or an act of vanishing.
I'm interested in people, ordinary people in extraordinary situations. And when you're 18 years old and you grew up in Lorain, Ohio, and Steel Mill Town among working class people, and they put you in this jungle war, that's an extraordinary context.
It sort of annihilates the self without annihilating the other. It annihilates the self into the other.
So who's telling the truth there? You know, everyone is telling the truth from their point of view.
Writing a poem is not reality because you're creating something, right? So it's not reality.
How do you get at the truth? Well, you try to bring as many points of view as possible. It's another reason why the eye is so important. And where I end up is always at this juncture of memory and imagination.
How do the two relate? In a parallel way, or they cross? What actually is unreality in reality becomes reality in a poem.
Being a poet for me is living the poetry, living literature as a way of life, as part of me, my identity.
First, my uncle was arrested, and then my grandfather, and then my father. My father was a political prisoner in communist Romania. He was 18 years old to 8 years, of which he served 5. And he spent those years in different prisons and forced labor camps.
I don't write and then go back and be sorry. This is very, close knit with what I am. And that's why I never say anything that I don't live it.
The reason for which he was arrested was because he wrote a poem against the Red Army occupation of Romania at the time.
I don't use slogans. I don't write because it is good or it is bad. If it's killed me, if I say it, that's the way it is.
Forgive me, Grandma, for not speaking sooner. My mouth was stitched by my mother and father, who thought it was best that way. I won't give you anything. 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 I won't give you any damn thing unless you leave me for dead. And they did. Cranking up the machine, the president explains, the first 80,000 are hard, the next 2 million are easy. Send in the troops, send in the troops, send in the troops, the tanks, the trains, send in the military tribunals, the prosecutors, the judges, send in the troops, the troops, the troops, to shoot them, chain them, jail them, send them where the mute had winged the mare. They must be guilty of something. Send in the troops. What makes a nation bite its own flesh? How does the country turn cannibal? In a burlap sack stitched shut, Grandma abandoned the cat that ate her own kittens. Rose, 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 rose. I see my grandfather in one of these rows, behind him his cousins, his neighbors, his friends. My father is further away, and the rows of the young ones work to death. Forgive him, Grandma, for not speaking sooner. His mouth was stitched with fear. I am a product of this machine that feeds on grandparents, on parents, and spits out the new generations, memory cards erased, then swallows us again and again. I was there in one of the school rows, my red pioneer tie flapping, proudly reciting my achievements. Today, my father lives closer to death than to his youth in the Gulag. In the grapevine shadow, we visit the past with flashlights of plum brandy. And we unstitch it thread by thread. We tear it apart.
One of the problems I had as a queer person was that as a citizen, as a person, as a daughter, you know, as a mother, I was not supposed to be anything but the role that was given to me. Other people had authority over what I should have been.
There are many ways to conceal. You use language, and you also use just flat out manipulating history, deleting or not printing in any kind of history books anything that's truthful, and distorting the truth in everyday media.
In Iran, I could do anything I wanted behind closed doors, no lack of anything. I want the right to talk about it, to announce it, and to have the right, you know, to be what I am outside of the closed doors, outside of the veils.
That's why it becomes so difficult for the regular people to see, and it's so hard to raise your voice when you have so many different systems, in fact, to deal with.
When you have the right to define yourself the way you are, it's as if for the first time you're living your life.
For witness, it means being present, being marked, being subject to being wounded. You can think of witness in other ways. It's the logic of evidence in the courtroom. It's the logic of the symptom in psychoanalysis.
So we change facts, but it's not lying. You lie to tell larger truths sometimes. I didn't see a girl running down the road with burning from napalm. I didn't see her really, but in my mind I could see her.
I'm trying to fuse them all into simply a term for being awake and to have the consciousness affected by the world that is about us.
But I put myself there because I felt a responsibility to be as close as possible to the event that I was writing about. I felt a responsibility to tell the truth about her.
You need to have the distance from the events to be able to write about them.
We cannot encompass the whole thing, okay? So in a sense, we are selective, but we are selective. The camera or someone is selective for you, which complicates things.
I think Romania is still coming to grips with what happened. As a nation, Romania still doesn't face the past in an honest way.
2006, 2007, when a journalist approached me, he wanted the interview for the largest newspaper in Iran, and the newspaper was the Tribune.
Journalism today, especially, you know, if you're talking about visual impact, is exactly what contributed to the relativization of truth.
I told him that you want to publish my interview to pretend that there is no censorship in Iran. I will not allow one word of my interview to be taken out.
The first question you always ask is, who's paying the historian? You know, is it the emperor? Is it the king? Is it the president? Is it the university? Who's paying the historian? Because that determines the spin on the historical events that you're going to end up with in the history books.
The first day that the newspaper was out, by noon they had collected it from all the newspaper stands. A huge group of plainclothes with batons and stones and everything attacked the building of the newspaper. The newspaper was closed for a year and a half, and the person who interviewed me had to apologize.
The information they relate, whether it is, you know, editorial or whatever, just straightforward reporting, comes, again, now almost a contradiction, comes at us, I'm not talking about directly, comes at us and goes away almost instantly because there's another information coming.
There is a whole class of poets who, for various reasons, simply did not enter the canon. They were women, and until fairly recently, women's poetry in, for instance, the 18th and 19th century was marginalized.
There must be a more interesting way to read this work, and it must be true that other poets had experienced various forms of extremity and written in the aftermath. So there must be a way to approach that work. We can't just dismiss it.
They haven't fitted a kind of template of what poetry is supposed to be.
And we have to have a way of thinking about it critically and allowing it to affect our conscience and our consciousness.
And what poetry is felt to be is respectable and middle class, and that it's fine for it to deal with difficult subjects, but perhaps not to challenge us too much when it comes to engaging with the political issues, or even the issues, more fundamental issues perhaps, of tyranny.
And poetry of witness opens a social space between the personal and the political, and what I regard as the personal are the matters of the hearth, domesticity.
پنجره را وا می‌کنیم، هوای سرد تو می‌ریزد، عزیزی که مرده است پلک می‌زند. هوای سرد اتاق را پر کرده، می‌لرزیم. عزیزی که مرده بر بستری دراز شده در گوشه‌ای که از گوشه‌های پرتو اتاق است. پیراهنی سفید تنش کرده ایم. ملافه‌ای سفید تا زیر چانه‌اش کشیده ایم. پاهایش از سرما می‌لرزد. موهایش را بافته ایم، دوبر صورتش روی بالش انداخته ایم. پنجره روبرو را هم وا می‌کنیم. سرما در سرما می‌آویزد. عزیزی که مرده اندک اندک کبود می‌شود. ملافه را اندکی بالا می‌زنیم. پیراهن را اندکی بالا می‌کشیم. پاهایش را از هم وا می‌کنیم. دخول می‌کنیم. برمیخیزیم، پیراهن را صاف می‌کنیم، ملافه را صاف می‌کنیم، می‌نشینیم. عزیزی که مرده اندک اندک برم می‌کند. ملافه اندکی بالا اندکی بالاتر می‌آید. پاهایش را از هم وا می‌کنیم، کودکانمان را بیرون می‌کشیم. پاهایش را صاف می‌کنیم، ملافه را پایین می‌کشیم. عزیزی که مرده از سرما می‌لرزد. کودکان می‌لرزند از سرما. ما چای می‌خوریم. پنجره را می‌بندیم. پنجره را وا می‌کنیم. کودکان را رها می‌کنیم. در آغوش ازدحام خیابان چای می‌خوریم. عزیزی که مرده است، عزیز عزیزی است. می‌رویم به سویش. ملافه را اندکی بالا می‌زنیم. پیراهن را اندکی بالا می‌کشیم. پاهایش را از هم وا می‌کنیم. دخول می‌کنیم. عزیزی که مرده است برم می‌کند. پنجره را اندکی وا می‌کنیم.
So the language is marked, the language is incised, the language is an open wound, the language is evidence. Just as much evidence as a cloth with a bullet hole in it is evidence in a court of law.
I already started to think in English. I was afraid to think in Farsi.
What we have in the literature of extremity is the way in which the human imagination has been incised, the way in which creative art becomes a mosaic chip of that experience, of that moment of human subjectivity.
When I had my line of thinking in English, it made me feel as if I'm not threatened by Farsi as a culture, as things that had happened before. The words didn't resonate you know, with fear.
It's perhaps difficult for someone who watches things, you know, war and things like that, but to accept that something that is real, I can see it, I can touch it, you know, I can even be part of it, is at the same time so unreal.
A poet and a writer who talks against taboos and who talks against the oppressions, who talks against the Sharia laws, who talks against the censorship in Iran, who belongs to the sexual minority, is at risk every minute.
If you apply a logic, if you apply a rational thinking, even human thinking, you know, you would say that this is not real. This is what the hell is this?
Threats that I got, with those threats in emails and the reactions I got from even Iranians in Toronto and people inside Iran, we knew that if I was in Tehran, I wouldn't be able to live.
But it is real, and it's happening, and you're part of it, or you see it, or whatever, you know. And then how do you relate to this when you try to say something about it?
Then you see that how many writers in Iran go through this fear. How many of them stop writing because of that fear? How many of them lose the means to feed themselves?
Are you making unreality more unreal? You know, or are you making reality, you know, too real?
I have my colleagues in Iran who are gay and lesbians and write. And you have no idea how they live with nightmares all the time. When they go online, it's as if, you know, they are on death row.
I didn't stop to consider the sociological implications before I acted or before I spoke out. Someone at the academic party said, vis-a-vis, and I lost it. I fell into a beautiful flashback, man, rockets that sound like trains through the night sky, but that was that, more or less instantaneous, so that no one noticed I had left and then come back. You don't have to tell me a thing or two about portals. I've seen the visitors come and go. There's the talk, and then there's the talk about the talk. And isn't this romantic, to love words and the sound of words, even as the bodies pile up in secret? Even as the children are terrorized out of their minds by bombs we pay for, you can only cover your mouth so you won't scream out loud.
Can you name an incident where the act of witness, in poetry in particular, changed, you know, dynamics in the way societies think, or you know, created a movement within people, a critical consciousness?
I'm also bothered by the fact that it doesn't seem to do any good to write about it, because if it did, then it would be over. There wouldn't be a war. And it also seems that the writing comes after the fact a lot.
Something in this impenetrable or seemingly impenetrable wall of system and culture.
All that aside, it's absolutely essential that we read about this as Americans, that we understand the way people who live on the fringe and people who don't have live.
And you could argue and say, well, that's not the function of poetry of witness. You don't have to have walls come crumbling down. But I'm not so sure that we perform acts of even cracks in the wall.
But how do I deal with that direct impact? You know, how do I make my reader think the thoughts that I was thinking, you know, in approaching the poem? Can I engage the reader to have those thoughts?
I remember somebody asked me, why do you always have to, you know, fight with the walls and break walls? And he said, I don't. The walls are there, they hit me, they fall down.
A poem can be many things. A poem can be a flame, a poem can be a sword, a poem can be a flower.
I hope it works sometimes, at least sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't work, you know. I cannot be the judge of that.
I saw, to my great shock, utter surprise, these talks have an effect on that network. I realized something was happening that I could never have imagined.
This is all about the intersection of art and the world, art and reality, the reality we all inhabit.
There are poems that affect the world at the time that are very strongly influential.
Poetry can speak to a whole group of people who respond to poems but don't respond to other forms of insights.
I lived it. I felt it happen. And I can't measure it, and that would be inappropriate. I have no idea what effect or to what degree that affected things. But I think it did. I felt it doing so at the time.
It's about the world in which we live. It explains to us something about the function that poetry has in our world.
What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.